Alrighty, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to session two of our Trees Forever Tree Keepers spring course. We're very excited to see you all back again for another great lesson. Uh, oh, the mascot. Yes, our mascot's name is Oakley. I've had the pleasure of wearing him a few times. Despite being an oak, I think he it appears to exhibit some signs of being an elm, but we didn't think about that when we came up with the name. So Oakley is the one that stuck. Um, well, thank you all again for joining tonight. Tonight's session, we'll be going over tree planting, how to do that, as well as tree care and pruning techniques. As usual, we do ask that throughout this presentation, you keep yourself on mute. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'll be kind of moderating those and highlighting questions to ask our presenters during the Q&A section. I believe one of our presentations tonight as well, there will be questions throughout the presentation, so we'll ask you to enter those into the chat. But yeah, without further ado, I do want to turn things over to Shayla Claiborne, who is our urban forestry project manager over in Des Moines, and will be talking to us today about tree planting. Take it away, Shayla.
Everyone,
Yep,
can you see my screen all right?
we can.
Okay, perfect. Um, all right. As Enzo said, I'm Shayla Claiborne. I'm the Urban Forestry Project Manager here in Des Moines. I get to look for the locations that we'll be planting each season and then work with the nurseries that we get our trees from. I'm just going to walk you through how we plant trees and some things to consider when you're planting on your own. Is that changing slides? Okay, fabulous. Okay, so we're going to take a look here. This picture is a pretty good guideline on things to consider when you're picking a location in your yard. One of the big ones is to consider power lines. Anytime there's a power line, we want to go with an understory species so that it doesn't grow up into your power lines. The utility companies will prune those way back to keep the power lines safe and clear. So we want to consider that for the long-term health of your tree. Also look over when you're considering planting things near your home. It's great to have them to consider half the mature height of the tree. You want it to be half the distance away from your house. So just keep all of those things in mind. And anytime there's like a utility box, things like that, the companies like to keep everything clear so that in an emergency or for whatever reason for maintenance, that way they can access those things. Um, oh, it's also really good to consider like sunlight exposure depending on the species of the tree. And then some trees don't mind having wet feet or do a little better in drier conditions. So just consider those things when you're choosing the species. Maybe for a more wet location, you consider like a swamp white oak, bald cypress, and then if you're like on a slope in a drier area, maybe a bur oak would be a better option. Also, a lot of times in compacted soils, like a new development area, you might want to think of something hardier that can put up with tough conditions or like high clay soils. So maybe think about like a hackberry or a thornless honey locust are really good options for more difficult situations.
And Shayla, real quick, could you go to presenter view so we could get that full screen?
Absolutely. Perfect.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right, next up, we are choosing that location, and then we're going to mark where we want the tree to be so that when we call Iowa One Call, we'll call 811 so that utility companies can come out and mark for where their utilities are and just to keep everybody safe. And that way we're not doing anything dangerous with our shovels. We just want to make sure everything's clear. Onto tools. It's really important to stay safe during our planting, so I definitely recommend wearing some gloves. Um, there can always be glass or who knows what's in the soil you're working in. So it's always good to protect your fingers. And then there's been a couple occasions with a root saw. If you're not wearing gloves, it can be dangerous. So it's just good to protect everything. And then a shovel and a rake, scissors and bolt cutters to get all the tree trash off. The bolt cutters are mostly for when we have larger B&B trees. Garden claws are a great option. Um, they're really good for helping you kind of move the soil away from the root flare of the tree. A lot of time that gets buried in the pot in the nursery. And then you'll want a water source and a way to transport it. For just one or two trees, a garden hose or 5-gallon buckets are great. For bigger plantings, if sometimes we have upwards of 60, 70 trees, we like to get a big water tank and haul it on our trailer. So just depending on how big your project is. Next, we're going to prepare the tree. We'll remove it from the container. Here in this photo, it's a soft bag, so you can just use any knife, should get it off. Sometimes you have a bigger plastic container. Those can be a little tricky. You can press the sides of the container to hopefully pull the tree out. Sometimes you have to do a little surgery, though, if the roots are growing through the holes and just cut around the roots so that there's room to pull them out of the container. Or you can just cut the whole container off. And then one of the most important pieces when you're planting is to locate the tree flare. If you think about like elementary school, anytime kids make the really nice tree drawings, they have the nice big flare at the bottom. We want that to be exposed. We don't want to bury that under a bunch of soil. And here you'll see it's about the size, about the thickness of a finger, depending on how big your tree is. But you'll also see those little fibrous roots here in that photo. And those do more for nutrients and water uptake. Those aren't what we're talking about for the flare, though. It's mostly those thick woody roots that we're looking for. Oh, and this is a perfect opportunity to use that garden claw again to really move that dirt away from the base. Here's a good example. It's it's just buried right at the soil grade there. And then next we're going to work on preparing our roots. Once we have our flare exposed, we're going to look at the rest of the root ball. You'll notice here that one in the middle is pretty painful to look at. That's without any corrections. So if you think about like a round plastic pot, anytime the roots get to the edge of it, they automatically start growing around in a circle to find more space to grow. So we want to prevent that by either cutting 3 to 4 vertical cuts, like you can see in the top right photo, to help break up that circular pattern. Or I often like to just shave off the edges of the root ball to get like the outside 1 to 2 inches. And that way they'll be more likely to grow out instead of continuing in that circular pattern. Oh, and if that circular pattern does continue, it can cause the roots to choke the flow of water and nutrients and will actually cause it to die a lot sooner. So you may not know for 10 years, but then at that 10-year mark, it might really start having some serious problems. So we just want to do our best to prepare the tree and keep it so that it grows long and healthy. Here's an example of a much more mature tree that had those roots continuing to grow in that circular pattern. All right. Next, we're going to work on preparing the hole. We always start by taking the sod and any competing plants off the top where we're going to plant the hole. I like to do 2 times the size of your plant. And we'll just take everything off the top there and keep the sod in a separate pile from your soil. That way we don't get it back in there. We don't want anything competing for water with the tree that we're planting. One thing, oh, sorry. Oh, yes, and always call Iowa one call. We want to be extra safe, not hit any utility lines. Continuing with our hole, we want it to be just deep enough that that flare is right at the soil surface. We don't want to plant our tree too deep. We also don't want it sticking way up, but a little high is better than too deep. You can use your shovels to help measure. This is especially helpful whenever it's a larger tree and we don't want to move the tree back and forth as much. But you can use your shovels to measure the height and the width to make sure that it's good size for your root ball. One thing to consider, sometimes people use augers to create these holes. I much prefer just a hand shoveled hole, but if you do have an auger, you'll just want to make sure that it's not too deep. They often get too deep of a hole. And if that happens, you'll want to put soil back into it and then stand on it to compress it. That way your tree doesn't sink later. It's also good to roughen up the sides of the wall because we really want to emphasize that those roots, we want them to grow out into the rest of the soil. We don't want them to be contained in that space. So we just want to make it as easy as possible. All right. Now that our hole is perfect and our tree is ready, the roots are ready to go in the ground, we can place it in there. You'll want to make sure that it's straight. We've planted a couple of crooked trees. We'll have to go back and correct here and there. So just always check out, make sure it's straight up and down, ask a friend. You can also have somebody hold the tree while you backfill the soil. But again, before you commit to that, put your shovel down and just make sure that root flare is there at the surface level of the ground. And then we don't recommend amending the soil because we want the roots to continue out. That's why we want it to be about 2 feet, or sorry, twice as big as the plant itself. That way those roots will continue out and not stay in that circular pattern. All right. Very important. Don't forget to water, especially on the day of. It's always good to give it a good deep soak to help it get established. And then you'll want to maintain a good watering routine to make sure, especially in the beginning, the first early weeks of after planting it, it's good to water it every couple of days. And then after a few weeks, once it's more established, you can go once a week. And then depending on how much rainfall we get, if we get an inch of rain in the week, then you're good to skip a watering. But especially drought times, you'll want to stay on top of it, especially these younger trees until they get real well established. Um, Oh yeah, here's an example of this one. You can see it doesn't have the flare and it's going to cause there to be a weak spot in the base of that tree. Um, so we just want to make sure we plant it at a good depth so it has good long-term potential. And then this is a beautiful flare that it's nice and exposed. And it'll have a good foundation. One of the really important pieces of planting a tree that I think it's overlooked is the value of mulch. Mulch is such a good resource for the trees. It adds nutrients back to the soil. It really helps to maintain moisture around the roots there at the surface. And then it also protects it from mowers and string trimmers, which can be a really big problem, especially in the city with humans. It's hard to protect the trees, and the mulch can help suppress weeds so that you don't have to get up closer to it. And yeah, it does a lot of damage. Those little string trimmers can really do some damage on the outside of the bark. You can also look for cheap or free places to get mulch around near you in the city, Public Works, and then there's also online you can look for chip drop, and it the quality and variety can change a lot, but it just partners people looking for mulch with like tree services that have excess mulch. Um, And yeah, don't be afraid to get together with some neighbors. Sometimes it's a lot of mulch, but it's a great option. And we like to stay local because we don't want to be transporting wood from out of state, and we just want to utilize what we have nearby. Oh, it's also, I know some people really like the colored mulches, and they can be fun. Just something to consider is a lot of times those are like less desirable types of wood. A lot of times they're broken down from pallets. Um, and so you don't really know what kind of chemicals or things or finish could be on that wood. Um, and also it won't break down as readily. It'll take a lot longer. So we're really missing out on a lot of those benefits. Oh, for our watering devices, when you're working with us, you'll encounter a couple of different ones. We like to use a slow drain 5-gallon bucket. Um, you can't see it in this photo, but those green buckets there, we drill like an eighth to a quarter-inch hole in the base of it. And that just allows us to move through quickly in our large scale plantings, but still allows the tree to get a good deep soak when we're watering. And then watering bags are another option. You can see one in the top right there. It also slow waters them. Those can hold more water. You just have to be careful because they are very vulnerable to string trimmers and mowers. And it kind of defeats the purpose because they cause a lot bigger holes. Um, and yes, we'll give our tree 2 gallons per inch in diameter each week. And so a smaller tree doesn't need as much water, but it still needs frequent watering. And whereas those bigger trees, you can do a deeper soak. We're just going to go over the different types of trees that we plant. Here are some different options. We have grow bags or root maker bags, containerized trees, bare root, and B&B or balled and burlapped. First ones are the root pouch. They can be really good for they have a good quality root system a lot of times. Whenever they're being grown out, the roots go until they hit an air source, and so they're made so that instead of continuing to circle like in a plastic pot, it'll just have a more fibrous root system, and it really prevents a lot of the girdling that have trouble with. They're also easy to move. They're usually smaller, and same planting process. They can be difficult to get out of the bags because sometimes those roots kind of hold on to the fibers inside of it. So again, you just cut it off and pull that bag off. And they can be more expensive, but you are paying for the quality of the roots a lot of times. Next, we have our container trees. This is what you see a lot at our plantings. There's a lot of different variety and sizes. They can be lightweight and easier to handle. A lot of mid-sized trees. I personally, for mobility, they have them in like gallon sizes is kind of how they refer to them. So like a size 7 or a size 3 through 10 are really good, like manageable sizes for an individual on their own. Um, and some cons for them is the soil incompatibility. They're a lot of times heavily fertilized and they're more drought susceptible, and with the girdling roots, it has a lot more root issues when we go to plant them in the ground. Just some more root correcting, and you just want to make sure, again, at the right height and everything. This is a good image for some things to take in mind for planting container trees. It's a lot the same as all the other processes. Here, it's just emphasizing we want the twice as big hole for the tree to go into. Um, and then, yeah, just making sure the soil and the mulch is back away from the root flare itself. Bare root trees are a really good option. They're really lightweight. The only thing, or one con of them is that they do dry out a lot faster. So when you get them shipped to you or picked up, you want to get them in the ground as soon as possible, and you want to keep them moist until you get them in the ground. They also are they're grown out in their like natural pattern, so you don't have to worry too much about root pruning a lot of times. They should be good to go in the ground, and you really want to shape your hole so that it's big enough for the roots. You don't want to just cram the roots into a small space. You want to really give them room to spread out. Staking might be required, and they are usually smaller stalk. And here's a good example. You'll see in this image, there's a mound at the bottom. It's really nice to kind of build up a mound for those roots to sit on and spread out across. That way it doesn't sink after planting. And then bottom burlap trees. These can be nice. They're quite large a lot of times. Most of the time, they're very large. And they come wrapped in twine and burlap and a wire basket to hold the form. These are field dug trees that come straight out of a field and are kept moist with the burlap, and they do need continuous watering. Definitely something to consider with these is like transplant shock. Some of the other options are smaller, but they don't take as long to get over the stress of transplanting them, whereas bottom burlap can take some time, especially the pulling them up out of the ground can be a pretty stressful process for them, and it just takes a few years for them to get established. They're often very heavy, so you'll definitely want a team of people and maybe some equipment. And then we really want to make sure that burlap and the wire basket is removed. Um, Here we are. It's pretty heavy to maneuver, so this is where like we want to measure the hole and make sure everything's good before we move it back and forth. That way we can get everything done in one go. They're using the wire snips there. You kind of have to take off the basket half of it and then lean it over and take off the other half. We also really want to retain the root ball, so we just do our best we can, the best we can to get the materials off. And if there is a little bit left at the bottom, it's not ideal, but rather than hurting the root ball, it's an okay option. Yep, and here it's saying to remove a third of the burlap, but I just take it all off or at least halfway if you can't get it all off. Because those materials really they don't break down fast enough. Especially even containers that say compostable, they might break down eventually, but they won't break down fast enough so that the roots can really have their spread and go where they need to go. And super essential to keeping your trees alive is having a plan. And again, if it's multiple trees or a public location, really having a team of people can be really helpful. Have a schedule so you know when they're getting watered, when they're getting mulched, who's doing the work. And then to really maintain your trees long term, you want to have good pruning so that they have good form as they grow older. Um, and then keeping an eye on drought conditions so that they have plenty of water is essential. And then if you have any questions, you can always contact the city or Trees Forever about tools or helping creating a maintenance plan. But definitely don't forget the watering and the mulching is essential. Ooh, sorry, I had one more thing. I just wanted to emphasize with the mulch to make sure and do that donut ring. We want a nice donut. We don't want a volcano. We see it all the time. The volcano mulch really adds a lot of moisture there at the base of the tree and causes a weak point for it. So just make sure and pull that mulch back away a couple of inches. And that's it.
All righty. Thank you so much, Shayla. All right, everybody. We've got some great questions already queued up in the chat, but I'm going to put a quick quiz. I'll launch that here. Hopefully, you can all see that on your screen. If so, if you want to give those a try, then as you do, if anybody else has further questions, please drop those in the chat for the Q&A afterwards.
Yeah, great questions. It looks like you got most everything answered there in the chat.
Yeah. I guess as we're
Wonderful.
waiting for the Q&A to finish or the quiz to finish, do you want to talk a little bit more? We had a question about does the planting process differ at all with like the little bare root seedlings as opposed to kind of the bigger trees that are bare root?
Um, that's a good question. The biggest thing is that the whole size is going to be a lot different. For larger bare root trees, they are much more expansive. They still won't need to be super deep. Um, because most of the trees live in that 6 inches to 24, sorry, most of the roots live in the 6 inch to 24 inch kind of range. So it'll be mostly be the width of the hole will be much larger. And then again, you'll want to make that mound a decent size and maybe compact it a little bit so that the tree doesn't sink.
Yeah, absolutely. We had another question that was kind of related to that. Kate was asking, so if you have like a small bare root tree that's maybe 2 feet tall, it's kind of stick-like, but it has a root or two that are very long. She was saying that she had, for instance, one that had roots that were as much as 2 to 3 feet long. Does the hole need to be that deep? Can it be trimmed? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. As much as you can maintain the roots, it's ideal. They'll definitely have a better survivability. If you do need to root prune them back a little bit, I would really do as minimal as possible and just like one or two of the like really long roots. That way, because just like the container planting, we also don't want them to hit the outside of the hole and then start to curl inwards. So we really want to make the hole plenty large enough.
Yeah, absolutely. All righty. Looks like we got pretty much everybody answered the quiz. So let's go over that real quick. So question number one was when planting a tree, the flare root should be, and it looks like about 80% of you got the correct answer, which is slightly above ground level, visible, and uncovered. So you want to make sure that root flare is open to the air so it can get all the oxygen and all the nutrients it needs to survive. Question number two is which of these growing methods is most likely to result in the most encircling roots? Pretty much everybody got that one correct as well. That would be container grown when the roots come up against that hard plastic shell that just results in them weaving themselves into a basket, so to speak. Question number three, when deciding to plant your tree, what should be your very first step? And yep, looks like everybody got that one correct as well. Call 811 before you do any digging. Trust me, you do not want to be the guy that hits a gas line or a power line or anything like that. I think we can, all of us here at Trees Forever have been in a situation like that before, so not a good time. All right, we have some more Q&A questions here. Randy asks, how much do you water a tree for how long at a time? It's hard to tell sometimes.
Yeah, that can be difficult, especially like hose watering. I like to do like a slow water for 15-20 minutes at a time. Again, depending on what size of tree, that's probably a 6 foot tree. Um, and then you'll want to do it, like I said, multiple times, like maybe 2 or 3 times the first couple of weeks. And then after that, you can slow back down to once a week. And one thing you can do too is to put your hose on trickle and see how much of a 5 gallon bucket it fills up. It's kind of a good gauge to see how much water your tree is actually getting. The biggest thing is just to slow water it. That way the water is not just going off and it's actually getting down to the roots.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, Another question we had, Kate says, someone told me burlap and ball is not as good because the roots were cut. They say it'll be weaker later. Is that true? Did she miss that in the cons?
I'm not too sure about long term for bottom burlap. It is definitely a well-established process. Like there's definitely a lot of nurseries doing it. Um, the main thing that I've noticed is just the initial spring back from transplant shock. I can't really speak on the root step, but they do have to cut quite a few of the roots off to transport them.
Yeah, and they're very heavy.
Yes.
Tatiana has a question. Do we have to cut vertically the roots? I guess, do you want to talk a little bit more about kind of the different methods of shaving the root ball?
Absolutely. Um, if you have Yeah, if it's in a container, I guess it's really important to shave off the sides. And we're really just cutting any roots that are going in the circle already. We're trying to stop that pattern from happening so that the roots that are curving will now be facing outwards. Yeah, that's why we like to do like the outside inch or two just to get anything that is wrapping already. But if you do see some that are circling, you can go in and actually prune those so that they're pointing straight out.
Alrighty. Does anyone else have any questions for Shayla? Give that a minute. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any in the chat right away. So thank you very much, Shayla. Very informative. Great job. Without further ado, I think we'll transition into what to do after you get the tree in the ground. So I'm going to invite James Partridge up to present, and he will talk to us a little bit about the post-planting care and a little bit about pruning.
Yeah, thanks, Sanzu. Here, I'll share my screen. Screen. Why is the button grayed out? There we go. Okay.
All righty.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is James. I'm the Growing Futures Program Coordinator for Lynn County. And today I'm going to be covering tree care and pruning. So thankfully my presentation will not be in an hour. In the next 30 minutes, I hope that you develop a greater understanding of the need for ongoing and routine tree care. You learn and can apply the basics of tree growth and how they respond to the health of your own trees. And you can apply these techniques to accomplish your landscaping goals. So the first question we have to address is, but don't trees grow in the forest just fine? Now, that's totally true, but we have to keep in mind that when we're planting in urban landscapes, these are totally different than what the forest floor would be like. In a forest, there's almost an unlimited amount of room for the roots to grow, for the canopy to spread out. But in these urban landscapes, we have man-made things like telephone poles, cars, roads, concrete, things like that. So they face a lot of obstacles uh, to fully mature throughout their life. So here's some pretty egregious examples of urban landscape trees. Now, I'm sure most of you will not be planting in the sidewalk or in concrete, but for the purposes of this point, I think these definitely make it. In urban landscape, trees often face things like soil compaction, poor soil quality, poor soil drainage, things like that, as well as, constant human interference, potentially cars, power tools, things like that. So they have a lot of obstacles to deal with throughout their life. So why should I care for my tree? Post-planting care, getting to the root of the problem, and pruning 101. These are going to be the four topics we're going to cover throughout this presentation. So first, why should I care for my tree? Answer is it's like living in an unnatural environment and will require care and maintenance to achieve the size and shape you desire. And urban trees often have shorter lifespans than their forest-dwelling cousins. Again, these are because of all the obstacles they have to face. It's been noted that urban trees compared to their forest dwelling cousins can live, at times only to 50% of their full lifespan. Now we can definitely extend that with constant maintenance and care, and pruning is a big part of that. So first, we're going to cover some vocab. I'm sure all of you know what a trunk is, but it's the main woody part of a tree beginning at the ground and extending up into the crown from which the scaffold limbs grow. And we will cover what scaffold limbs are later. The root collar, this is the base of the trunk where the roots and trunk merge. They become swollen as most trees grow. And this has many different names. It's referred to as the root crown, the root flare, the trunk flare. But the photo to the left shows a nice, healthy, established root flare. This is the ideal shape that you want your tree to take. You don't want a telephone pole. You want to have it flare out as it meets the grass.
Oh, hi, Eggs. Hi.
And then we have the stem girdling roots, also known as SGRs. These are roots that grow against the trunk in such a manner as to reduce translocation or the movement of substances through the trunk xylem and phloem. Now, xylem and phloem are different layers of trunk tissue that transport water and nutrients. And as Shayla mentioned, we really want to remove these stem girdling roots before the tree goes into the ground. Now, trees can push through and survive, but it really makes their life much more arduous. 10 years in the future, you might have a tree, quote unquote, suddenly die, but it's really just been like a 10-year long slow death. And we have a branch. So this is a shoot or stem arising from a larger and older stem. We have subdominant or subordinate stems. So this can be emerging from the trunk or from another branch. We have secondary branches coming off of branches. And we have the branch collar. So this is going to be the photo on the bottom right. This is a very important piece of tree anatomy. It's a swelling or bulge to the base of a branch where it connects to the trunk. This is where the tree's defense mechanism called CODIT, compartmentalization of decay in trees, is contained. So when we prune, we really want to keep in mind where the branch collar begins and ends, and really protect that as we prune. We have the establishment period. So this is the duration between planting and root regeneration sufficient to sustain the tree. This is when you really need to baby your tree. You need to give it plenty of water. You need to make sure that the base of the tree is covered in mulch, not the root flare, but beneath the crown. And here's that CODIT. So this is the process in which trees will seal over wounds. Trees don't heal in the same way that humans or animals heal. They really just kind of plug off wounds just to prevent pathogens or fungi from entering inside the trunk. There's the central leader. So this is a dominant stem located more or less in the center of the crown. There'd be in the photo in the top right. This is the part of the tree that grows up and gives the tree height. Ideally, we want to have one central leader, because if we have more than one, we get into codominant stems. So this is a stem or branch growing at about the same rate with nearly the same diameter as another stem originating from the same union. And this is the photo on the bottom right. So you can see there's two trunks growing from one trunk. Now, the structural connection between the two is definitely weaker because, at least in this case, it has something called included bark. This is like a growth defect. We'll get into that later on, but this is something we want to address early on in a tree's life and make sure there's only one leader. And apical dominance. So this is an inhibitory control exercised by the apex, the outermost portion of the shoot, over the growth of the lateral buds below. So basically, it's a hormonal response that tells the tip of a stem or a branch, even the leader, to keep growing up and then have the lateral lower buds grow out. So it's really trying to focus its energy into growing straight up. All right, getting to the root of the problem. So the establishment phase. There is an equation that you can do to figure out your tree's establishment period. So that's going to be 1 year standard plus 1 year per inch trunk diameter at the time of planting. So if you plant a tree with a 2 inch trunk diameter, that's going to be 3 years in total. Now, throughout these 3 years, you're really going to want to make sure that you're giving it consistent water, um, so it can regrow some of those roots lost, as well as making sure that there's mulch at the base. Throughout this period, the tree is working to reestablish those roots in a new environment. So it might go through transplant shock. You plant the tree, it looks like it's dying, but it just needs some time to rebound and get used to its new environment. Again, urban trees are often killed by soil compaction and poor soil quality. This can be because of vehicles driving over it. Maybe during the landscaping project you had a bunch of heavy equipment driving over your lawn. All these things make it more difficult for the roots to grow out and absorb their nutrients. So we want to leave your soil as undisturbed as possible. And again, be sure to prune those circling and girdling roots before the tree is planted. These can be somewhat resolved later on in a tree's life, but it costs a lot of money, takes a lot of time, and it's just easier to solve it before it's even a problem. And you really want to keep branch pruning to a minimum during establishment. I would just kind of take it off the table as even an option. During this period, your tree needs as many leaves as possible to produce as much energy as possible to get all those roots established and growing. So for the first couple years, don't even consider pruning. So change is hard. Your tree probably came in, like Shayla said, a burlap or a root bag, pot, something like that. So no matter what you put it in, it's going to be different than what it was used to. Now, in these two photos, you can see that these trees are planted above grade. Now, the landscaping looks nice. Maybe the brick matches the brick of your home. It's kind of a nice centerpiece, but this is really adding extra strain to the tree during this establishment period. Being above grade, the tree isn't going to be as insulated from the elements. So tree mortality. So try to keep it as natural as possible, and really use mulch instead of rock. You also have to keep in mind placement and the species that you've decided. So, for example, I wouldn't plant like a cottonwood right in front of your breakfast window with the hopes that it'll become like a nice shrub at some point, because cottonwoods grow super fast, maximum height, 75, 100 feet in ideal conditions. So that's eventually going to grow to become a hazardous tree, maybe cause some property damage. In these photos, I'm sure that these homeowners, well, I guess I can't say I'm sure, but there's a good chance these homeowners didn't choose to plant the tree this close. Maybe this was a squirrel or a bird that dropped a seed or a nut. But we have to keep our expectations of what we can do to alter the tree's characteristics feasible. We can't push those natural characteristics beyond what nature allows. Because if we do, we then get into expensive hazards. So again, property damage, whether it be your roof, your home, cars, but also the safety of those around you. We can avoid this just by doing proper placement. And it is unfortunate when a tree does become a hazard and it is a nice, old established tree, because we have to take it down, which costs a lot of money, removes the beneficial ecosystem aspects, and it's just a generally sad thing. All right, now let's get into pruning 101, some of the basics. So before you prune, please take some time and try to identify some hazards or potentially hazardous conditions before you begin. These include things like falling objects, nearby valuable property, and of course, keep in mind where your family is at the time of pruning, dogs, animals, things like that. Pruning can be very dangerous, so please know your personal limits and respect when the task at hand is beyond your ability. Um, Even if you really want to get that branch that's just been driving you crazy because it's ugly, if it means you have to step on the top step of a ladder and just barely hang on, it's not worth it. Do what's reasonable, and if not, reach out to a professional. Now, here's a quote from the Tree Care Industry Association. They published an article in 2025 with the following: Tree care is a high hazard profession. Fatality rates are estimated at 10 to 30 times the national average, and more than 1,000 injuries occur annually. Again, very dangerous thing. Take the time, identify hazards, and you should be safe. You also want to observe the condition and the natural characteristics of your tree. And this includes the mature shape. So to the right, you can see some of the common tree forms that exist. Different tree species will fall into different forms. A bur oak would be a spreading form, and a round would be more of like a linden. Conical is going to be getting into like the firs and conifers. Again, we can alter the shape of a tree, but we have to keep it within the tree's limits. Also, the age of your tree. Once again, don't prune during that establishment phase, or if your tree is at a point where it's kind of towards the end of its life and you want to extend it, maybe reconsider that pruning objective. The overall health of the tree and the risk of infection. Some trees are more prone to different infections depending on the time of year, and also the tolerance to pruning. Uh, some trees only have a couple branches on them at a time. Good example is like Kentucky coffee tree. Doesn't have too many branches until it becomes a little more mature. So if you were to take off like two branches when it has four in total, you're reducing that crown size by like 50%, which is going to have some pretty catastrophic results. So first, you want to set a clear and realistic pruning objective. You also want to prune at the right time, referring to the season. Ideally, it's going to be like early spring to late fall. To avoid most pathogens and insects, you're going to want to prune when temperatures get to near freezing or below freezing. You want to choose the right tool. If you have a pair of hand pruners, don't try to cut a 3-inch in diameter branch. Tools have their limits. It also just means you're going to be safer if you're using the right tool. And you want to review the proper cutting steps to make sure that you're not going to harm yourself, but also harm the tree. And finally, make the cut. So setting a clear and realistic pruning objective, you want to identify the pruning goal, maybe even draw out like a picture of what you want your tree to look like, and try to keep these goals set. Don't try to change it in the middle. If you have multiple objectives with one tree, try to piecemeal it together. Don't try to do a ton of work at one time. Now, you might be wanting to do this to raise the crown, maybe to help the plants beneath it. Structural integrity, maybe you have one of those co-dominant stems where there's two trunks out of one, and it looks like maybe one side is going to break off. This is going to help preserve safety and property value. Again, safety, you might have some large dead branches that could potentially fall and hurt someone. Tree health, maybe you have some dead branches from a super cold winter, or maybe your tree at some point suffered through some sort of infection, has some dead branches. You can remove those. Or honestly, it might just be for aesthetics, which is pretty common in landscaping. So, pop quiz. If a tree has a growth rate of 3 feet per year and has a branch 10 feet off the ground, how far off the ground will that branch be in 15 years? Give you some time, 15 seconds. The answer is 10 feet off the ground. So trees only grow up from the top. They don't grow from the base. Wherever a branch is on the tree, that branch is going to stay right there. So if your expectations are, I don't need to deal with that branch because it's going to grow and eventually um, miss my roof or miss some part of my property, just keep in mind that the branches are going to stay put where they are, and it's just going to be the very top of the tree that's going to be growing. Pruning at the right time. Again, prune disease, dying, or dead material at any time. Um, Before you prune something that looks like it might be dead, try to do just a very minor surface scratch just to see if there's some green beneath it. Sometimes, especially this time of year, most trees look like they're kind of dead. But just double check that there isn't any green living tissue before you make that final cut. And depending on the season, you're going to have to change your objectives. So some ornamentals, flowering trees can be pruned immediately after flowering. So keep that in mind if you have something like a crabapple or a redbud. Uh, Identify the diseases your tree may be susceptible to and prune when infection risk is low. Again, there's a lot of different diseases out there, and the ideal time is going to be that late fall, winter, early spring, colder temperatures. When it comes to oaks and elms, you definitely want to prune when they're dormant to decrease the risk of pests and disease damage. Some of these diseases include oak wilt, oak blights, and Dutch elm disease. These are pretty devastating diseases to where if your tree gets infected, there's a high likelihood it's going to die. Um, there has been some advancement in uh, creating a somewhat of a vaccine or medication for your tree. It's not commonplace and it does cost quite a bit. So keep these pruning tips in mind to just avoid dealing with disease. And many species can benefit from summer pruning as well, such as maples and birches. If you prune later on out of the summer season, you might have to deal with some bleeding, as they say, just kind of excessive sap drip. So if you want to avoid all that sap running down the side of your tree, you can prune maples and birches in the summer. So you want to avoid pruning during the initial growth flush in the spring. We want to leave as many buds as available so that your tree can fully leaf out. And no matter the age, of course, outside of establishment, remove no more than 20 to 25% of living tissue at a time. So this is the maximum amount. I would set this for each season. So 20 to 25% per season. And the best time to prune is during the dormant seasons, so late fall to early spring. Now, suckers are a natural response from your tree to produce more leaves due to stress, damage, or disease. In the photo to the left, you can see that there is what looks like a second tree growing at the base. Now, these are unsightly, so I understand wanting to remove them, and you oftentimes can safely remove them even in the early establishment period of your tree's life. This is just part of the transplant shock, trying to get used to its new surroundings. So you can safely prune those. Choosing the right tool. So always wear personal protective equipment or PPE when you're pruning. So this includes eye protection. Don't want to get a branch to the eye, gloves, and maybe hearing protection if you're using something like a chainsaw. The most common pruning tool is going to be pruning shears. These are these small scissor-like cutting tools, often used for pruning branches 1 inch or less in diameter. I would recommend that everyone has one of these. These are good for like flowers as well, beyond trees. And then there's loppers. So these are just a blown up larger version of pruning shears, often used for pruning branches 1 inch to 2 inches in diameter. And once you start exceeding 2 inches in diameter, that's when I would switch over to a pruning saw or a chainsaw, pole pruner, power pole pruner, something that can just deal with that larger diameter. And pole pruners are just pruning saws. It's the tool all the way to the right, just used to reach high up branches. They oftentimes have like a small lopper attached to them. So pretty nice tool, pretty handy if you need to prune branches that are elevated. And you always want to sanitize your tools with isopropyl or rubbing alcohol when moving between trees to reduce the transmission of infection. So even if you're pruning within your yard, moving tree to tree, I would still just quickly rinse it off, get a rag, wipe it off, just try to reduce that disease transmission. So now let's target the cut. So if you remember the branch bark ridge, this is going to be what gives us an idea of where we are going to place our cut. Um, the branch bark ridge and branch collar are usually in line, so it's going to be a peak or a crest at the union of the branch to the trunk. So we want to cut just beyond that. If we cut into the branch bark ridge and into the branch collar, the tree is going to have a difficult time plugging up that wound. Could potentially invite insects, pathogens, fungi, things like that. So we want to do it just beyond that branch bark ridge and branch collar. Another pop quiz. So which line shows the correct pruning location? Is it A, B, or C? I'll give you about 15 seconds. The answer is B. So you can see we're just past that collar. Another way that you can tell is the difference in bark texture. So usually the texture of the trunk is going to have more definition, larger peaks and deeper valleys. The branch is usually going to be a bit smoother. It's not going to be true with every tree, but it is just kind of a common observation you'll see. And it's better to cut further out toward the end of the branch than into the trunk. So it's okay to leave a nub. It's not best. Even besides aesthetics, it does leave more dead material attached to the tree. So I would just recommend trying to get just beyond that branch collar. Again, avoid cutting too close to the trunk, damaging the branch collar and branch bark ridge. And if the branch is over 2 inches in diameter or has a substantial weight at the end, I recommend using the 3-point cut method to avoid injury to the tree and yourself. And we'll go into those steps. Pruning branches 2 inches or less in diameter are least impactful to your tree. This is referring to large mature trees. Of course, if you have just planted a 6-foot tree that's only 1 inch in diameter of the trunk, that's a large branch. So this is for fully mature trees. 2 inches or less are not that impactful. And do not use tree wound sealants unless pruning an oak or elm during growing season. And again, you really shouldn't be doing that to begin with. These tree wound sealants were thought to sort of speed up that process of blocking off the entrance for pathogens, but in reality, it doesn't really seal very well, kind of can trap in moisture, and that moisture can be a breeding ground for fungi and other pathogens. So I don't recommend using wound sealants. So here's the 3-point cut method. So the first cut you're going to do, and you can see in the diagram, cut 1 is going to be your undercut. So you're only going to go 1/3 through the branch, and this is to prevent bark peel. So once you move on to cut 2, your overcut, you're going to cut all the way through the branch. And if we didn't do our first cut, the undercut, that bark would probably strip all the way down the branch, potentially go into the trunk and just peeling it all the way down. So make sure you do that undercut to reduce bark peel. And once you finish your second overcut, you are going to leave a bit of a nub. This is when you go back for your final cut, and this is where you'll cut the remaining branch and avoiding that branch collar and branch bark ridge near the trunk. It's much easier, especially if it's a large branch with a lot of weight, to do these careful cuts that don't cut too far into the trunk by removing all that weight. So take a picture of this diagram if you'd like. Maybe write down these steps. This has come in handy many, many times. So some cuts to avoid. Pollarding. This is a sort of a landscaping taboo to where if you want to reduce the crown density and size, it will basically cut back every single branch tip down to ideally the nearest bud, but it looks like this was sort of just tipped, not even back to the nearest bud. Um, the growth that'll come from pollarding is going to be really stringy. It's your tree is not going to look nice. Yes, it's going to accomplish the uh, reduction of crown size, but it's really just causing a lot of stress for your tree, and it's for the most part unsightly. And then flush cutting. So this is when we ignore that branch collar and we cut too deep, as well as not doing that undercut. You can see there's some pretty serious trunk damage on this tree. That tree is not going to heal. It's not going to plug up those entrance wounds, and it's probably going to face some pathogen. So earlier I mentioned the scaffold branches. These are the large primary branches of a tree that form the main structure and support the smaller lateral branches. Um, these are what really give your tree its shape. Um, these are also the most like structurally secure branches on your tree, and I would try to keep these as much as possible. You can see the photo up top. Tree has all of its branches, and the photo below it, they've removed some of the smaller ones, but they've really kept those main structural scaffold branches intact. They also have the least likelihood of breaking and falling, so there's a benefit. Now, pruning young trees. So let's say that your tree is out of that establishment phase. If left untouched, trees in the urban landscape can create problems for themselves later in life. And the best way to prevent this is early intervention. So in the photo up top, you can see some branch rub. So that branch is rubbing on the trunk. It's kind of whittling through that trunk layer, and it's going to start exposing living tissue. Again, tree could potentially get sick. And the photo below that is definitely an overcrowded tree crown. So you're going to have more branches rubbing. The branches are going to crowd each other out, going to have reduced access to sunlight. So do not prune live tissue at time of planting to compensate for root loss. That's going to serve no benefit. It's only going to hurt your tree if you try to keep the root reduction the same as crown reduction. So leave all your branches intact at the time of planting, and do not prune healthy tissue during that establishment phase. Do not ignore your tree for many years. You got to keep up on it. You got to do some checkups. You're kind of your tree's best friend and doctor in a sense. But do prune out dead, dying, or diseased tissue. Do prune to encourage and train a single leader if appropriate. And do remove crossing and rubbing branches. Do select, retain, and train those scaffold branches as well. So you can begin pruning roughly 3 to 5 years on average based on the trees that we plant, which are about 6 feet tall, 1.5 inch diameter trunk. And that 3 to 5 will ensure that your tree is most likely established. Smaller, younger trees, the branches under 1.5 inches in diameter. Most of that pruning can be done with pruners or loppers. You can see in this photo. When you're removing limbs or the ends of branches, remember to cut just beyond that branch collar and branch bark ridge. And try to cut it at a 45-degree angle, shown in this photo, just beyond the nearest bud. So with that apical dominance, that bud all the way at the tip, which is now the tip since you've made the cut, that will take over as the furthest bud, and that will then continue the growth of that branch. Mentioned earlier were codominant stems with included bark. So this is a growth defect, commonly seen as a V shape. You can see in this split photo, there's a large kind of black crack that falls all the way down the middle. This is a very weak union. prone to splitting, as seen in the photo to the right. The best way to address this is just by removing one of those leaders, picking one that's either the straightest or maybe the most full in its crown. Now, you may see a union that looks like a U instead of a V. Now, these U unions are structurally strong. They don't have that same included bark. It's not a growth defect. It's just sort of a natural characteristic. So you can leave that in place. It's going to be strong, while the V is where you're going to be prone to splitting. Again, the best option is to prune when young so that there's only one codominant stem early and encourage one central leader. A good thing to mention too is some trees will just naturally have multiple trunks, multiple codominant leaders, such as like river birch. I would just leave that be. That tree has evolved and grown the characteristics to have multiple trunks. You don't need to reduce that down to one. You can leave it as a cluster of three or however many it had. For large cases of codominant stems on mature trees, I would definitely urge you to consult the local ISA certified arborist. They can do different techniques, such as this cabling, where they're going to install two hooks and then have some braided metal wire or potentially chains holding it together. This is really like last resort for a large mature tree. Again, try to address it when it's young to avoid the problem. Some species that are prone to codominant stems would be maples, oaks, and elms. Again, oaks and elms, you got to be careful that season, but maples are a little more forgiving with season. So how to protect your tree. This is a photo from one of our right-of-way trees. Has some pretty bad deer rub. That tree unfortunately did not make it. There's also rabbits. Definitely lower to the ground, still just as devastating. It's removing all that trunk tissue, preventing the tree from sending water up the trunk and nutrients, as well as something called sun scald. This is from rapid temperature fluctuations. So when we have a rapid jump from cold to hot, and vice versa, the sap and liquid within the living tissue can expand and contrast, causing cracks and dead underlying tissue. We also have mowers and trimmers. This is where Shayla mentioned that you really should put mulch at the base to prevent weeds from growing, so you don't have to have that trimmer so close to the trunk. Also, improper staking. When you're staking your tree, try to use a flexible material. This is arbor tie. This is definitely a recommended material, but not when it's knotted around the trunk. You want to make an open loop. You don't want to constrict the growth of your tree because your tree will find a way to grow around it. We were able to remove this tree tree tie, but it was very difficult. There was a lot of damage. Not entirely sure if that tree is going to make it. But also decorations. Try to avoid hanging large, heavy decorations that pull on branches. Now, lightweight lights or small little ornaments, those are probably okay, but just try not to suspend large, heavy objects from your branches. So to protect your tree, we can put on tree guards to prevent bark damage. These are pretty cheap, found at most hardware stores. I would just take some zip ties just to close the open end. We can prevent the trunk girdling and the constriction by having open loops. In this case, it's connected to two stakes with those open loops, so the tree has room to grow outward. And if your tree has faced sun scald, it's not a super common thing. You can put a white tree guard around it. This will help with preventing it from absorbing too much heat from the sun's rays. Again, not a super common issue that we face. Definitely want to be looking at those tree guards and proper tree tying. So why should I care for my tree? Trees can't tell when they're sick or struggling, so they need you to provide regular checkups. I'm not saying every day, but definitely every season, try to get out there, do a bit of an inspection, see how the tree's growing. If you need to change any of your habits, maybe it needs more water, maybe it needs more mulch, or maybe it's ready to be pruned. Trees provide many benefits to us. They provide wildlife habitat, they help combat climate change, they mitigate flooding, and reduce urban heat islands, which is definitely something that Cedar Rapids is facing with all that open exposed concrete and asphalt. And properly cared for trees can help increase property value, reduce residential speeding. This is a real study, look it up, and reduce crime rates as well. Not sure if it's causation or correlation, but we're going to hope for causation. All right, that is it.
All righty. Thank you, James. Great work. I'm going to put our next quiz out here. And as we're waiting for that to fill out, please feel free to drop some more questions in the chat. We've got a lot of great ones so far. James, as we wait, Sean asks, well, he says that's a beautiful open grown tree. Is that a bur oak? He asks.
Oh, in this photo right here?
In this photo, yeah.
Yes, I believe it is.
Very nice.
I kind of wish I looked into the origins of this tree, but I'm going to be honest, I just looked for large mature tree. So, but I think he's right. It is a bur oak.
All good. All right. Well, we're still waiting for some answers to come in, but maybe we can tackle a couple of these Q&A questions while we wait. Kate asked towards the beginning of the presentation, if you see an adult tree with stem girdling roots, can they be cut at that point, like in that picture, or how do you kind of tackle that as an established tree with girdling roots?
Yeah, it's a pretty unfortunate situation. I would not recommend you going out and trying to remove them yourself. Now, professionals can come in and do what they call like air spading. So they can take like high pressured air, blow away all the surrounding dirt to fully expose those roots. Oftentimes, removing roots that are that large, especially when they're that close to the trunk, the tree is going to definitely be stressed out, potentially die. In most cases, if a tree is established and mature but has stem girdling roots, you're really just going to have to monitor health, try to help it out. There's not that much that can be done.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah.
All righty. Looks like we got a pretty good number of answers for the quiz, so let's go over these as a group real quick. Question number one was, when pruning just after planting your tree, you should. And it looks like everybody got the correct answer. That is, prune out dead, diseased, and dying branches. I want to do that pretty much right away. And then question number two, what time of year is best to prune oak and elm trees? Again, looks like pretty much everybody got the correct answer, which is late fall through early spring, kind of during that dormancy period. So great job, everybody. All right, let's dive into the Q&A. We had a few questions asking for some clarification on, should the tree be fertilized during the establishment phase? How does that kind of work?
Yeah, so in our tree planting, we don't use any fertilizer. I really just keep it as natural as possible. Fertilizer can mess with the root establishment process. It can sort of trick the tree into putting out more leaves and not focusing that energy into root growth. So I would really not use any fertilizer at all.
All right, awesome. We have a question here from Kate, a bit of a long one. Let's see. Question about co-dominant stems. Sometimes you have a tree that a dominant leader at 6 feet tall, then you notice a 12 feet tall and one of the other branches towards the top has caught up. Now they look equal and split, but by then it's harder to reach. And then Kate asks, do I really need to get rid of one? Is central leader most important at the bottom or even at the top later? Can you speak to that at all, James?
Yeah, good question. So sometimes you can have what may have started as a co-dominant leader early on, but then one of them sort of began to grow laterally. and then the other one continued to grow up. So you do have a second tree somewhat, but it's no longer contesting with that uh, more vertical leader. So for the most part, if it's not creating that really sharp V, um, I wouldn't worry about it. I would also, maybe take a look at that tree, see if it is a V, maybe if it's a U. But if one of them has surpassed the other one in heights by, doubling its height, I think you said 6 to 12, I would say that that codominant is probably safe to just leave as is.
Excellent. We had a question from Alicia. When you notice a spontaneous tree, like from a squirrel planting, growing, that you try to remove, but it keeps growing back, how can you get it to stop growing back?
So in that case, I would think that it might be a some suckering trees. So there's a chance that maybe it's in your property, maybe it's in your neighbor's property, or in a forest behind you. There is something like a cottonwood or maybe a honey locust, where these are species that are prone to suckering, so they'll send out new shoots. Um, but if it is truly a squirrel that is just constantly burying nuts, I would just say keep pulling it out unless you wanted to do or to consider squirrel, um, preventative measures, different like sprays and things like that to keep them out. But yeah, try to look in to see if it's maybe some suckering tree nearby.
Excellent. Um, we had another. Could you talk a little bit about the optimal time to prune to avoid bacterial slash pest infection?
Yeah, yeah. So that's going to be in the dormant seasons. So I would say late to mid-November. Really just depends on when we get our first good freeze in. So fungus and bacteria, insects, they don't like the cold. So if you prune during that dormant season, you know, late November to early March, I think you drastically reduce the chance of pathogens and infection.
Let's see here. If flush cutting happens in like some sort of storm or accident, is there anything we can do afterwards to help it heal?
Let's see, if this question was a couple years ago, I probably would have recommended putting some of that sealant on. But now that we kind of know what we know with those tree sealants and how they kind of just uh, pose an increased fungal infection risk, I would say really just monitor the tree. Uh, yeah, unfortunately, just try to keep it dry. Don't have if you choose to do like some sort of like trunk guard, make sure that has some holes in it for like air to pass through, so that it doesn't have just you know stagnant water or stagnant air. Um, yeah, unfortunately, just keep an eye on it.
Do you have a recommendation on when the best time is to prune suckers?
Uh, Boy, I mean, in our experience, planting right away trees, we have often just pruned them like at the time of planting. Um, Again, these are like on average 6 to 8 foot tall trees, inch and a half trunk diameter. So these suckers are pretty small. Um, Even like a year after planting, the suckers are maybe only like 6 to 8 inches. But we really just prune them like when we see them. So I don't think there's really a time of year, unless it is that elm or oak where they are prone to those specific, um, harmful diseases. Any other species, I think you're probably good to just snip those off.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Question here. Do you tend to notice that cherry trees tend to have double leaders more than other trees? This person was starting to look around. They realized many mature cherry trees in their area had them. Wondered if that was typical or if these were just not pruned in particular.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of wondering if you're referring to like the large black cherries or maybe like the smaller choke cherries. But I have noticed that large mature black cherries in like the forest do often have codominant stems. But I will say that union is usually the U shape, not the V shape, so it doesn't have much of a risk of splitting. Now, in the case of like choke cherries and more residential ornamental trees, I don't think I've noticed too many codominant ones.
Okay. Um, Another question, how do you prune or cut back on pine and or spruce trees?
Oh, good question. Definitely start from the bottom up. Again, kind of depends on your pruning objectives. You know, is it raising the crown? Are you trying to make some room beneath it or around it? Uh, Conifers still follow that same rule as like angiosperm deciduous trees. So they're going to have a root collar. They're going to have a branch bark ridge. Same thing with cutting the tips. You know, you want to cut it back to like the furthest clump of needles. Um, yeah, they're pretty similar in pruning rules.
At what size are trees safe from deer rub? Is there like a diameter that they become safe? Do they ever get safe? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, in our experience, so all of our trees that we plant and we care for them 2 years after planting. So planted at about an inch and a half. At the end of those 2 years, we've had some trees, you know, get up to like close to 3.5 max diameter. And some of those are still affected by deer rub. I would say once your tree gets to like that 6 inch diameter, and also at that point, the bark texture tends to change. Like as a tree gets older, its texture uh, becomes more defined compared to when it was a young juvenile. And deer tend to like the sort of smoother, softer bark of younger trees. So as your tree enters, you know, those teenage years, and gets to like 6 inches in diameter, I think you're pretty much out of the woods, but it happens to any tree.
Yeah. Randy asks, should we prune suckers off mature trees in our parkways or right of ways as soon as they appear?
So if it's in parkways and right of ways, I would really just notify the city. Again, right of way trees are going to be city property unless you got a permit to plant the tree there. But I would still just clarify that with the city. Try to have their arborist team come out and take a look at it. Uh, yeah, I would probably just notify the city.
Um, Another question here, should we lay compost around the base of trees each year? Does that help at all?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if you want to do compost like beneath a layer of mulch, definitely. If you're going to do the two together, I would probably reduce the amount of mulch that you use. You know, so you don't have this giant pile built up on the edges. But sure, yeah, compost is going to add, you know, more nutrients back into the soil.
Yeah. All right. I think this is our final question. Kate says, I heard it was bad to cut off the bottom layer of evergreens like people tend to do because the branches all use lower branches for strength or support, like to hold snow, for instance. And if you remove the bottom, you give more chance for the ones above it to break. Is that true in your experience or not?
Yeah, no, that is a good point. That's sort of why I held off on even mentioning pruning conifers for the most part. You know, unless there's like damage, that's kind of when I've pruned them. You know, conifers do rely on the level below them for that structural support. You know, it is like a sort of triangle pyramid shape. Um, and all of those branches are kind of those scaffold branches mentioned that hold the tree's shape and have the most structural integrity. So to the person's earlier question of pruning evergreens, you know, really only do it if it poses like a risk to you know, property or safety, things like that. It does mess with the tree's ability to survive the elements by removing those lower branches. Um, but no, that's a good point.
Yeah. All righty. Well, I think that's all the questions we have for today. So thank you very much, James. We really appreciate your presentation today. Great job.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.